No one understood why he bought a rusty train car. Then they stepped inside. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video for morning sunlight filtered reluctantly through the dusty blinds of his apartment, casting a pale glow on the flaking paint and water-stained ceiling. Ezra Cole sat on the edge of his sagging mattress, his elbows on his knees, staring into a chipped mug of tepid instant coffee. Behind him, the radiator clanked and hissed, its irregular sputter the only disturbance in a silence that had permeated the apartment for years. At 52, Ezra was accustomed to the quiet. It had become a constant companion, a heavy blanket that settled over him after his world had slowly disintegrated. The apartment was sparsely appointed with a rusty bed frame, a small table, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a bookshelf that held only a single, cracked picture frame. In the photo, a younger Ezra stood proudly next to a woman with a radiant smile and warm eyes. Ruth, his wife, his everything. She had been gone 3 years, taken by ovarian cancer. The diagnosis arrived too late, their insurance was insufficient, and the system had been unforgiving. Ezra had fought for her, selling their car, emptying their savings, and pleading for more time off work. He had clutched her hand through her final days, whispering tales of their youth, as if his words could turn back time. She slipped away in the early hours of a Wednesday, her fingers laced with his. After she was gone, the world seemed to lose its color and its kindness. He took a slow sip of the bitter coffee and winced. He could still remember waking to the aroma of fresh toast and sizzling eggs while Ruth hummed in the kitchen. Now, his mornings were a mechanical routine of folding the same blanket, walking to the same sink, and pointedly ignoring the same mirror. He knew what gazed back at him, a chin shrouded in gray stubble and eyes burdened by sleepless nights. A stack of unopened bills sat on the table. He knew their contents without reading them. Utilities were overdue, and the rent was barely covered by his disability checks and the occasional odd job. The assembly line where he had worked for decades had shut down, another casualty of Detroit's slow decline. His knees and back ached with the memory of years of hard labor. He glanced out the window at a weak winter sun struggling against the frost. Another bleak, empty day stretched before him. His gaze fell upon a small box next to the table. Inside were her letters, some dried flowers she had once pressed in a book, and a folded deed he hadn't seen in 2 decades. It was for a piece of land in North Carolina, near where his grandfather, Levi Cole, had once lived. A wooded plot with a rusted fence, and little more than trees and memories. Ezra picked up his phone out of habit and opened the web browser. His thumb scrolled idly through listings for old tools and used bikes. Nothing held his attention until he saw a peculiar post from a man in West Virginia. Vintage Pullman railcar, 1920s. Weathered, needs TLC. $700 OBO. Buyer must transport. Below the text, a grainy photo showed a long, rust-covered train car sitting on overgrown tracks. The windows were shattered and the paint was peeling, but something about it resonated deep within him. He stared at the image for a long time, more focused than he had been in months. Pullman. His grandfather Levi used to speak of them with reverence, calling them the Cadillacs of trains. Ezra recalled riding in one with him as a boy, the scent of old leather, the creak of the wood floors, and the countryside rolling by like a series of paintings. He clicked on the listing. The description was brief, sold as is. Located in Mountaineard. Buyer responsible for relocation. Ideal for restoration or scrap. To most, it was junk, but to Ezra, it felt like an opening. Not a grand entrance, but a doorway nonetheless. He leaned back, a small shift occurring in the weight on his chest. That night, he paced the small room, his mind racing. A familiar, louder voice warned him of all the ways it could fail. But a smaller, quieter voice he hadn't heard in years asked, "What if it doesn't?" He opened the box again and took out the old deed. He remembered being on that land as a child, helping his grandfather chop wood. The memory, buried under years of city grit, suddenly flared to life. Maybe the train car could go there. Maybe he could build something not just for shelter, but for himself. The next morning, he made 3 calls. The first was to the seller, a weary-sounding man named Otis Freeman, who was surprised anyone was interested. "It's yours if you can get it," he said. The second was to a transport company. The quote was steep but just barely possible. The third was to a county clerk in North Carolina, who confirmed the land was still in his name. Over the next 3 days, he sold what little he had left. When the money was secured, he wired the payment for the rail car and signed the delivery contract, his heart hammering with a feeling that was equal parts courage and madness. On the day he left, he stood in the empty apartment one last time. As he stepped out into the cold air, he felt something new settle within him. Not happiness, not yet, but the faint outline of purpose. The train car was waiting, a rusted piece of the past, but then so was he. The transport truck groaned as it climbed the final gravel road, the forest pressing in on either side. Ezra sat rigid in the passenger seat, his knuckles white around the strap of his bag. He had been silent for the last hour, his gaze fixed on what lay ahead, his heart pounding. Behind him on a flatbed trailer, the Pullman car loomed like a specter from another era, long and weather-beaten. The driver, a young man named Deshaun Briggs with mirrored sunglasses, leaned out the window. "We're getting close," he said. "You said the entrance was just past this bend?" Ezra nodded, his throat tight. "Right up ahead. Look for a rusted gate." They rounded the curve and saw it, nearly swallowed by creeping vines and tall grass. A sagging chain-link gate, one side buried in the earth, the other swaying in the wind. Behind it, a narrow dirt path disappeared into the trees, leading to the property his grandfather Levi had once treasured. Deshaun slowed the truck. "You sure this is the place?" Ezra managed a faint smile. "As sure as I'll ever be." The truck lurched forward, crunching over leaves and fallen branches. As they drove deeper, the trees formed a canopy that dappled the afternoon sun onto the forest floor. They pulled into a small clearing where an old cabin had once stood. Now, only a flat patch of mossy earth and a few warped boards near a collapsed chimney remained. Ezra stepped out of the cab, his boots sinking into the soft ground. It was smaller than he remembered, but it was still his. "You want it off right here?" Deshaun asked, climbing down. Ezra looked around, then pointed to the edge of the clearing, where a strip of sunken railroad track, a remnant of an old spur line, was visible. "Right there," he said. "On those old rails, the process was clumsy. The winch strained as it pulled the heavy car onto the uneven track. Rust flaked off in clouds. Finally, with a loud metallic groan, the car settled into the forest as if it had been there for a century." Ezra stood alone as Deshaun's truck rumbled away, the sound of its engine fading until only the wind and the birds remained. He turned to face the Pullman car. It was worse up close. The exterior was a mess of corrosion and faded paint. The windows were jagged shards of glass and rotten rubber seals. The door hung askew on its hinges, bent inward at one corner. He approached and laid a hand on the cold, rough metal. It was solid. He could feel the strong bones of the structure beneath the decay. He stepped inside, and the air hit him, stale, musty, and sharp with the smell of mold. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light from the broken windows. The floor groaned under his weight, and a small creature scurried into the shadows. He could make out the original layout. Twin seats bolted to the floor, their cushions long gone, and iron luggage racks clinging to the walls. He walked down the narrow aisle, finding empty bottles, scraps of cloth, and faded graffiti scrawled on the walls. At the rear, he found a splintered cabinet and a small, grimy window. He looked through it at the trees, swaying gently outside. There was a strange peace to it, this rusted skeleton resting in a forgotten corner of the earth. That night, Ezra unrolled his sleeping bag in the center of the car. He set out his few belongings, a flashlight, a book, Ruth's letters. He hung a small battery-powered lantern from an overhead hook, its dim light casting long, flickering shadows. He slept fitfully. The wind moaned through the gaps in the car, and every creak of metal or skittering sound in the dark startled him. He woke before dawn with tears on his cheeks, the memory of Ruth's last moments fresh in his mind. His breath fogged in the chilled air, and his bones ached. But beneath the fatigue, A quiet resolve was taking shape. He looked around a broken, filthy space. It was forgotten, but so was he. And here they were, together. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air. Mist hung low over the forest. He began to walk the perimeter of the clearing, planning. By midday, he had a small fire going and had swept the inside of the car, dust rising in thick clouds. He worked until his arms ached, but when he stopped, the floor beneath his feet was visible, solid, and real. That evening, as the setting sun painted the car in hues of orange and gold, Ezra sat on the steps. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. For the first time in years, he had a plan, a thing to build, and it was enough. The morning arrived with a low-hanging fog that clung to the trees like old ghosts. Ezra stood outside the Pullman, his breath visible in the cool air, taking in the scent of pine and damp earth. The fire he'd kept smoldering through the night had burned down to embers. He had survived another night. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long while, Ezra felt a flicker of pride. Not for what the rail car was, but for what it could become. He saw its potential, the way a sculptor sees a figure inside a block of stone. He had to believe those same metal walls could one day hold warmth and light. After a breakfast of crackers and canned peaches, he started sorting through the heap of rotted furniture and scrap he'd piled up. Much of it was useless, but he found pieces he could salvage, organizing them into neat stacks of wood to be sanded and metal to be straightened. His joints ached with each movement, a familiar pain from 30 years on the assembly line. He worked with a steady purpose, his fingers throbbing and his shirt soaked with sweat as the morning chill gave way to the warmth of the afternoon. While clearing a storage alcove, Ezra discovered a loose metal plate. Behind it, half hidden, was a heavy wooden crate. He dragged it into the light, and pride opened the groaning hinges. Inside was a collection of hand tools, screwdrivers, hammers, chisels, and files. He thought they must have been left by a trespasser until he wiped the grime from the inner lid and saw the initials carved into the wood. L. C. Levi Cole, his grandfather. Ezra sank to the floor, his fingers trembling as he picked up a familiar wooden-handled hammer. He remembered holding it as a boy, his grandfather's large hands guiding his. But the most significant find was a thick, leather-bound notebook tucked in the corner. On the front, in neat cursive, it read, "Notes. Summer of 1972". He opened it to find page after page of Levi's handwriting, detailing repair techniques and planting strategies for the land. Interspersed were his grandfather's reflections and philosophies. "The forest will always outlive the house," one entry read. "Build with humility," another said. "A home isn't four walls. It's the space you protect with your effort." Ezra closed the book gently, a tightness in his chest. The weight of his grandfather's legacy wasn't a burden. It was a connection, a lifeline thrown from the past. That evening, he began sealing the worst of the gaps in the rail car's walls using scrap paneling and salvaged 2x4s. With only a handsaw and his own patience, the rhythm of the work, saw, measure, nail, soothed him. By nightfall, he had cleared enough space to hang his tools and clothes on a wire line. The car felt less like an empty shell and more like a workshop. The next day, he drove his old sedan to the nearest town. Inside the hardware store, the air smelled of sawdust and rubber under buzzing fluorescent lights. As he gathered nails, sandpaper, and wood glue, he felt eyes on him. The clerk, a woman named Marla Tate, watched him with a neutral gaze that bordered on suspicion. Another customer, a man in hunting clothes named Reggie Holloway, gave Ezra a long look before heading out. It was a familiar, unspoken question. "What's he doing here?" At the register, Marla rang up his items without a word or a smile. Back in the quiet of his car, Ezra took a slow, deep breath. He had lived long enough to know the difference between curiosity and judgment. He didn't let it fester. Back at the clearing that evening, he noticed movement in the trees. A small boy, maybe 10 years old, stood at the edge of the woods, watching him. The boy, thin and carrying a backpack that seemed too big for him, just stared. Ezra raised a hand in a quiet greeting. The boy took a step back, then vanished into the forest. He returned the next day, standing in the same spot, watching Ezra work. After a while, he crept closer. "You living in there?" he asked. Ezra set down his tool. Trying to, the boy nodded. "Looks like a train. It was a long time ago." There was a pause. "I'm Caleb," the boy said. Ezra, another pause. "My mom said some crazy person moved in out here." Ezra offered a faint smile. "Maybe she's not wrong." Caleb smiled back. From then on, Caleb was a regular visitor. He'd show up in the afternoon, sometimes with a snack, and watch Ezra work. Soon, he was asking questions, wanting to help. Ezra taught him patiently, showing him how to hold a hammer, how to measure, how to respect the tools. One afternoon, Caleb didn't show, and Ezra felt a strange void. The next day, the boy returned with something wrapped in foil. "My mom made sweet cornbread," he said. "She said thanks for keeping me out of her hair." A few days later, a tall woman in a blue sweatshirt walked into the clearing, her arms crossed and her eyes cautious. "I'm Tasha Moore," she said. Caleb's mom, Ezra, stood. "Ezra Cole." "A pleasure." She surveyed the clearing, the Pullman, the neat stacks of lumber. Her gaze softened. "He talks about this place nonstop," she said. "I had to see it." As she and Caleb walked away, Ezra felt a small crack in the isolation that had surrounded him. That night, he sat by the fire with his grandfather's journal, Caleb's hammer beside him, and a belly full of cornbread. The train car was becoming something else entirely. Autumn settled over the forest, turning the leaves to shades of gold and amber. Ezra rose each morning to a crisp chill, the smoke for the Pullman's new stovepipe curling into the sky, a thin ribbon of life where there had only been decay. The transformation inside was profound. The floors were now patched with warm, sanded planks. One end of the car was a cozy sleeping area with a cot, shelves holding books, a lantern, and a framed photo of Ruth. The other end had become a sitting area and workspace, with a handmade table beneath a large window fitted with salvaged glass panes. Curtains, sewn by Tasha Moore from old fabric, framed the view of the woods. On one wall, his grandfather Levi's tools were mounted with care, like treasures in a museum. Outside, he had laid a stone path to the dirt road, built sturdy steps up to the car's door, and added a small platform for sitting in the sun. He had scrubbed, sanded, and painted the Pullman's exterior in deep forest green and old brass gold. It no longer looked like a wreck. It looked respected. One bright morning, Caleb asked, "Did you ever ride on one of these for real?" Ezra smiled. "A long time ago. My grandfather took me once. When I was about your age." Caleb's eyes widened. "What was it like?" Ezra sat down beside him. "It was loud, and it smelled of oil and iron, but it was magical. Back then, a train meant you were going somewhere. And everyone, white, black, rich, poor, shared that journey, though not always in the same way." Caleb looked confused. Ezra paused, the weight of history in his voice. "Back in those days, people who looked like us had to sit in certain cars, usually the worst ones. Even these Pullman cars, often built by black craftsmen, were off limits to most black passengers. We built them, but we couldn't ride in them like everyone else." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's not fair." "No," Ezra said softly. "It wasn't." That evening, Tasha came by with a basket of vegetables from her garden. She watched Ezra and Caleb working together to repair a window. "He's got the bug," she said with a small smile. "I haven't seen him this focused on anything since his father passed." Ezra glanced at the boy, who was measuring a board with intense concentration. "He's a good kid," he is, Tasha said, "and I thank you for being here for him." Word of the transformed train car began to travel through the small town. A group of high schoolers rode their bikes out to see it, standing in awe of the restored interior. They started returning, bringing small contributions. One boy, a tall student named Jalen Thomas, brought an old oil lamp with a broken base. "Figured you might know what to do with it," he said. Ezra had it fixed in a week. Soon, people stopped by not just with curiosity, but with purpose. Danielle Brooks, a single mother, asked for help fixing a door hinge. Walter and Naomi Ellis, a retired couple, brought canned peaches and sat on the platform, listening to Ezra's stories about the Pullman porters who helped shape the black middle class through their dignity and hard work. The place was becoming more than a home. It was becoming a center of meaning. Yet the past still lingered. Ezra hadn't spoken of his son, Andre, in years. But one night, he found an old, creased photo of Andre at 17, standing in a cap and gown between his proud parents. The memory of their last argument echoed in his mind. Andre's angry words, "You gave everything to her and left me with nothing." And his own pained reply, "She was dying, son. I didn't know how to do both." The silence that followed had lasted for years. The next day, while working near the door, an envelope fell from the pages of Ruth's old Bible. Inside was an unfinished letter to Andre. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I'm already gone. But please know your father loved you more than he could say. Sometimes love is quiet, son. Be gentle with him." That night, Ezra sat at his small table and began to write. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest. He wrote about the train car, the work, the people. He told Andre about Ruth's letter and her love. He folded the pages, slid them into an envelope, and wrote a name he hadn't written in years across the front. He set it by the lantern and sat listening to the forest breathe around him. The letter to Andre sat on the table for 3 days, a quiet, expectant guest. Ezra wasn't sure if he had the courage to send it, so he poured his energy into his work. He built a new set of steps, scrubbed the brass nameplate on the side of the car until Pullman standard number 47 gleamed, and fashioned a circular table from a discarded cable spool. Above the front window, he hung a hand-carved cedar sign that read, "Hopeline." The rail car no longer resembled a ruin. It looked like a destination. The community's interest grew. Vivian Rhodes, a retired librarian, arrived with boxes of books, and Ezra immediately cleared a shelf for a reading room. Nia Carter from the community garden brought herbs in clay pots. 2 teenage girls, Imani Fields and Zoe Bennett, delivered a colorful quilt they had sewn. Visitors were now common, bringing gifts and staying to talk. Someone suggested a storytelling night, and to his own surprise, Ezra agreed. On a cool October evening, the woods filled with voices and footsteps. Lanterns lit the path to the clearing, where a fire crackled and folding chairs were arranged in a circle. Inside the Pullman, a table was laden with hot cider and Tasha's molasses cookies. Ezra greeted each guest, his quiet smile growing as they marveled at the warm, personal space he had created. He began the evening with a story about his grandfather Levi. Then Tasha shared a funny tale, and one by one, others shared memories and jokes. As the last guest departed, Ezra stood alone in the firelight, feeling a profound sense of connection. The next week, the local elementary school called. A teacher, Miss Celeste Ward, had heard about the project and asked if Ezra would host a field trip for her class studying American history. He was hesitant, but Caleb encouraged him. "You already teach me," the boy said. "You just don't sound like a teacher." So, on a Wednesday morning, a yellow school bus arrived. 24 children spilled out, their faces full of wonder. Ezra showed them the restored car, telling them about the black craftsmen and porters who built and worked on these trains, forming one of the first black labor unions and quietly feeding the fires of the civil rights movement. The children listened with wide-eyed respect. One little girl looked up at him and asked, "Is this your house?" He smiled. "It's more than that now." That night, after the children's voices had faded, Ezra finally picked up the envelope. The next morning, he stood in line at the post office and handed the letter to the clerk. "First class, please," he said. He walked out into the sunlight, feeling both lighter and heavier. He returned to his routines, but a part of him was waiting. His letter to Andre had offered only the plain truth, without demands. He had told him about the Pullman, the community, and his mother's last wish. He had told him he was sorry. 12 days passed. On the 13th day, as Ezra was tending the herb pots, he heard footsteps. He straightened slowly and turned. A tall, lean man with broad shoulders and dark mahogany eyes stood at the edge of the clearing. His hair was close-cropped, and dust covered his boots. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the man's voice, low and rough, broke the silence. "Dad," Ezra's throat closed. Andre stepped forward. "I got your letter," he said, swallowing hard. "I wanted to see Ezra took a step, then another. "I'm sorry," Andre whispered as they came together. "So am I," Ezra managed, his own voice breaking. They embraced, the weight of years dissolving in the crisp fall air. Later, they sat on the platform, sharing cider in a comfortable silence. Andre looked at the restored train car, the flowers, the trails. "You really build all this?" he asked. "With help," Ezra replied. "Friends, neighbors, your mother." In a way, Andre nodded slowly. "It's beautiful." Ezra looked at the man his son had become and understood that redemption didn't ask for perfection, only presence. As the sun set, casting the rail car in an amber glow, he felt it fully, the warmth, the forgiveness, the joy. His home had been built from rust and memory, but now it was welcoming the world. The following morning dawned with the soft light of early spring. Ezra found Andre by the fire pit, poking at the embers. They shared a quiet nod, the need for words having lessened. Ezra rekindled the fire and boiled water for coffee. They sat together on the platform, watching the forest awaken. "Didn't sleep much," Andre said after a while. "Me neither," Ezra replied. The silence that followed was companionable, like two travelers resting at the same destination after long, separate journeys. Finally, Andre stood up. "Show me the rest." Ezra led him through the Pullman, letting his son absorb the details. Andre moved with a quiet reverence, his fingers tracing the worn woodwork and pausing at the shelves of books and tools. He ran his hand over the polished table and stopped before the framed photo of Ruth. "She would have loved this," he said, his voice soft. "I think so, too," Ezra replied, his own throat tightening. They spent the day working side by side, reinforcing a section of the wall. Their movements fell into a natural rhythm, the shared labor smoothing the jagged edges of their years apart. Caleb arrived that afternoon, grinning when he saw Andre. "You came back," he shouted. The two quickly fell into easy conversation, with Caleb enthusiastically describing every corner of the renovation. Tasha Moore arrived soon after with a casserole, a knowing smile on her face. "You must be the son I've heard so much about," she said to Andre. "Didn't think you were real," Andre chuckled. "Most days I wasn't, but I'm trying." That evening, the clearing filled with people again, drawn not by an invitation, but by the pull of the place itself. Lanterns glowed, music played, and plates of food appeared. Laughter and conversation mingled with the crackling of the fire. Ezra stood on the Pullman steps, a warm mug in his hands, watching it all. Andre leaned against the doorframe beside him. "You did this," he said. Ezra shook his head. "Not alone, but it started with you," Andre insisted. After a moment, Ezra asked, "Are you going to stay?" Andre hesitated. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to come back. Help out. Be around, that's enough," Ezra said. The next morning, after the guests were gone, Ezra handed Andre a small wooden box. "Your mother's," he said. "She wanted you to have it." Andre opened it to find letters, photos, and a delicate locket. He looked up, his eyes glistening. "Thank you." After Andre left, the Pullman car didn't feel empty. It felt grounded, rooted in memory and possibility. The days grew longer. Caleb brought friends to help build a rain catch system. Tasha started a community book swap using the Pullman's collection. A local artist painted a mural on the side of the car, a tree growing from train tracks, its branches cradling the stars. Ezra added one final touch, a wooden plaque near the step, carved with steady hands. It read, "Pullman Hope 407. For those starting from scratch, one afternoon, a group of students gathered at the platform, notebooks in hand. Their teacher, Tamika Glenn, introduced Ezra as the steward of a living history. He didn't know what to say, so he simply invited them inside, poured lemonade, and told them about rust and loss, and how a person with nothing can still build something that matters. He spoke not of tragedy, but of change, of hands that fix what is broken, and of how the past could be a blueprint, not a burden. When the students left and the forest grew quiet once more, Ezra sat by the fire and opened his journal. "You can't undo what's been done," he wrote, "but you can choose what grows from it. He closed the book and looked toward the old tracks that once led nowhere, seeing a future rolling quietly forward. The rail car stood behind him, a heart beating steadily in the forest, its walls full of stories, its roof open to the sky. It was home, and it was ready for the next soul searching for a place to begin.